We all carry stories, narratives we've constructed about ourselves and others, often built on half-truths, misunderstandings, and outright self-deception. It's an interesting phenomenon, really, how stubbornly we cling to these internal fictions, especially when they serve to protect us from looking too closely at our own reflection. I've seen it countless times on my stage, a parade of individuals convinced they are victims of circumstance, architects of their own misfortune, or, in some of the most challenging cases, blameless casualties of another person's flaws. I recall one particular woman, let's call her Brenda, who walked onto my set carrying a mountain of grievance, a lifetime's worth of hurt she had meticulously cataloged and attributed, without question, to the men in her life. Brenda's story, as she presented it, was a familiar one, yet beneath the surface, it held a unique, almost tragic intensity that demanded a closer look. She was a woman in her late 40s, sharp-witted, articulate, and outwardly confident. But there was an underlying tremor in her voice, a flicker of raw, unresolved anger in her eyes that betrayed the polished veneer. She was convinced that her ex-husband, a man she'd spent nearly 2 decades with, was solely responsible for every significant setback, every emotional scar, and every unfulfilled dream in her adult life. From the financial struggles after their divorce to her strained relationship with their adult children, from her inability to maintain a successful romantic relationship since to her general dissatisfaction with life, it was all unequivocally his fault. He was painted as manipulative, selfish, financially irresponsible, and emotionally abusive. And to hear Brenda tell it, she was the innocent party, the wounded warrior, the one who had simply suffered the consequences of his actions. Now, I've heard plenty of narratives where one person truly is the perpetrator and another the victim. There's no doubt that real abuse and genuine betrayal happen every single day. But what caught my attention about Brenda wasn't the fact that she had an ex-husband who had likely made mistakes or even caused her pain. That's common enough in divorces. It was the absolute, unwavering certainty in her conviction that she was entirely absolved of any responsibility, any contribution, any role in the dynamic that had unfolded. She wore the label of victim not as a burden, but almost as a shield, a protective layer against introspection. She saw herself as fundamentally good, hardworking, and well-intentioned, perpetually let down by a series of inadequate partners, chief among them her ex. Others in her life had probably bought into this narrative too, reinforcing her belief that she was the one who had been wronged, perpetually suffering because of someone else. The central problem, as I saw it, wasn't just her anger, but her complete inability to look inward, to acknowledge her own agency, her own choices, her own role in the dance of their relationship. That kind of singular focus on external blame is a psychological dead end, a prison built with the bricks of resentment and cemented with denial. It keeps you stuck, unable to move forward, because you're constantly looking backward at what they did instead of forward at what you can do. My initial impression of Brenda was that she was a woman in deep pain, yes, but a woman who had perhaps unconsciously weaponized that pain. It wasn't just about seeking justice or understanding. It was about maintaining a particular self-image, one that required another person to be the villain. This wasn't just a breakup. It was a foundational story for her identity. If her ex wasn't entirely at fault, then what did that say about her? What did that mean for the years she'd spent nurturing this resentment? It was clear to me from our initial conversations, even before she stepped onto the stage, that we weren't just dealing with a relationship gone bad, we were dealing with a deeply ingrained pattern of thought, a cognitive distortion so pervasive that it had become her operating system. She had meticulously built a fortress of blame and from within its walls, she felt safe, even justified. But safety at the cost of self-awareness is no safety at all. It's a cage. And my job, as I saw it, was to find the cracks in that fortress, to gently but firmly pry open the bars, and to show her what lay beyond the comfortable confines of her self-made prison. It was never about diminishing her pain, but about helping her reclaim her power from the very source she believed had taken it. When you spend decades in this line of work, you start to see patterns not just in individual behaviors, but in the very fabric of how people construct their reality. Brenda was a classic example of someone whose present was so inextricably linked to her past, not just in terms of events, but in terms of ingrained coping mechanisms. It became clear very quickly that her story about her ex-husband wasn't just about him. It was a narrative she had been perfecting for years, perhaps even decades, long before he ever entered the picture. As we delve deeper, it emerged that Brenda grew up in a household where accountability was a shifting target. Her mother, by Brenda's own admission, was a highly critical woman who often deflected her own shortcomings onto others, particularly Brenda's father, who was described as a quiet, enabling presence. Brenda learned early on that blame was a powerful tool, a way to avoid criticism, a means of self-preservation. If someone else was always at fault, then you weren't. If you weren't at fault, you weren't imperfect, you weren't wrong, and you didn't have to feel the sting of shame or the weight of responsibility. It was a survival strategy she adopted, a psychological shield she crafted in childhood to navigate a volatile emotional landscape. This isn't to say her mother didn't genuinely have issues or that Brenda didn't experience real hurt. It's about how those experiences shaped her internal compass. So by the time she met her ex-husband, she already had a well-practiced script. In the early days of their relationship, she described him as charming, attentive, and secure. All the things she felt she lacked, he filled a void. But as relationships do, theirs evolved, and the initial glow faded into the realities of shared life. What Brenda saw as his emerging flaws, his perceived irresponsibility, his emotional distance, I saw as fertile ground for her deeply ingrained pattern to take root. Instead of communicating her needs directly, instead of taking responsibility for her own feelings or contributing to the dynamic, she began to externalize. His actions became the sole cause of her unhappiness. His perceived failures became the reason for her unfulfilled expectations. It was easier to point the finger than to examine her own role, her own insecurities, her own unmet expectations that might have been unrealistic or poorly communicated. I observed that Brenda possessed a keen intellect, a sharp memory for slights and grievances, and a remarkable ability to articulate them. But this very strength became a barrier. Her intelligence allowed her to construct elaborate, logically consistent arguments for why he was wrong and she was right, why he was the problem and she was the victim. This wasn't about malice. It was about self-preservation. Every accusation she leveled against him, every detail of his perceived misdeeds she recounted, served to reinforce her own self-image as the wronged party. It was a defense mechanism, a way to avoid the terrifying prospect of confronting her own contributions to the downfall of her marriage, or indeed the shortcomings in her own character. The deeper fear I suspected was that if she admitted any fault, even a small one, the entire edifice of her identity might crumble. What if she wasn't the good, suffering person she believed herself to be? What if she had played a role in the very outcome she decried? This fear was paralyzing. Underneath the anger, the blame, and the meticulously organized catalog of her ex's failings, I detected a profound sense of helplessness. It was almost as if by assigning all responsibility to him, she was inadvertently abdicating her own power. If he was truly the source of all her misery, then only he could fix it. Or, failing that, she was doomed to perpetual suffering. This created a peculiar paradox. She outwardly expressed immense strength in her conviction, yet psychologically, she was trapped in a passive role, a perpetual victim, awaiting external rescue or validation. She craved control, but her method of achieving it, through blame, ultimately rendered her powerless. She wasn't actively changing her circumstances. She was merely reacting to the perceived damage inflicted by others. This was the fundamental loop she was stuck in. Blame, feel helpless, repeat. The consistent thread through her life was this refusal to acknowledge personal agency when things went wrong. It wasn't just her ex-husband. There were fleeting mentions of difficult bosses, unsupportive friends, and other relationships that had soured, always with the blame squarely placed elsewhere. It was a pattern she had carried from her formative years, solidified in her marriage, and now was actively destroying her ability to build a fulfilling future. She genuinely believed her life would magically improve if only her ex-husband would acknowledge his wrongdoing, apologize, or somehow rectify the past. But that's a fantasy. Healing doesn't come from others' admissions. It comes from your own. My task wasn't to absolve her ex, but to help Brenda see the internal blueprint she was using and to understand that she held the pen to rewrite her own story rather than just endlessly narrating the parts where she felt wronged. The core of the problem wasn't just the blame, but the underlying psychological mechanism that compelled her to use it. The dynamic between Brenda and her ex-husband, even years after their divorce, wasn't just stagnant, it was actively escalating. They were still co-parenting, or at least attempting to, their 2 adult children, and every interaction became a battlefield. Brenda would call him supposedly about the kids, but the conversations would inevitably devolve into a rehashing of old grievances, thinly veiled accusations, and emotional manipulation. He, in turn, would respond with a mixture of exasperation, defensiveness, and a resigned weariness that only seemed to fuel Brenda's fire. She saw his defensiveness as proof of his guilt and his weariness as a sign of his disinterest, both of which validated her narrative of him being the villain. The children, of course, were caught squarely in the middle. Brenda would often confide in them, sharing her grievances about their father, effectively positioning herself as the suffering parent and him as the neglectful or harmful one. This is a classic, insidious form of parental alienation, whether intentional or not. She wasn't just telling her side of the story, she was actively recruiting allies in her battle against him. The kids, naturally, loved both parents, but found themselves constantly walking on eggshells, trying to navigate the minefield of their mother's anger and their father's withdrawal. They were experiencing what I call loyalty conflicts, torn between their parents and often feeling guilty no matter what they did or said. This further entrenched Brenda's narrative. If the kids seemed distant from their father, she would see it as proof of his poor character rather than a consequence of her own actions in poisoning the well. The emotional toll on Brenda herself was immense, though she refused to acknowledge it. She was living in a constant state of low-grade anxiety and anger, always on alert for the next perceived slight, the next opportunity to confirm her ex's villainy. She would recount trivial incidents from years past with the same fervor as recent perceived betrayals, as if each memory was a fresh wound. She was constantly running on adrenaline, trapped in a psychological feedback loop where her anger fed her blame and her blame fed her anger. She was exhausted, despite her insistence that she was simply fighting for what was right. Her inability to move on professionally or romantically was directly tied to this escalation. She'd start new relationships, but inevitably, her resentment towards her ex would seep in. She'd compare new partners to him, or, more subtly, she'd bring the same patterns of blame and externalization into these new connections. When things inevitably faltered, she'd add another name to her list of people who wronged me, reinforcing her belief that she was simply unlucky in love, never examining her own role in these dynamics. Her career suffered too. She'd lose focus, get easily frustrated by colleagues, and project her anxieties onto workplace situations, always finding external factors to blame for her lack of advancement. She truly believed she was simply facing bad luck or unsupportive environments, never connecting the dots to her internal state. The breaking point, the moment that pushed her to appear on my show, was a particularly ugly dispute over their youngest child's college tuition. Brenda felt her ex wasn't contributing enough, wasn't being fair, wasn't living up to his responsibilities. He, on the other hand, argued he was doing what he could and that Brenda was being unreasonable and financially manipulative. The conflict became so vitriolic, so all-consuming, that it threatened to completely sever any remaining ties with their children. The kids were devastated, feeling like pawns in a never-ending war. It wasn't just about the money, it was about power, control, and the validation of Brenda's long-held narrative. She wanted him to admit he was wrong, not just about the tuition, but about everything. She wanted him to finally say, "Brenda, you were right. I ruined your life." And because he never would, the cycle continued. Her friends, I imagine, were tired. Her family was worn out. Even her own children were starting to distance themselves, not because they didn't love her, but because they couldn't bear to be conduits for her incessant anger and blame. That's a crucial inflection point. When the very people you love and rely on start to pull away, it's often the wake-up call, the signal that something has to change. Brenda, however, interpreted this as further proof of her suffering, further evidence that everyone was abandoning her, further justification for her stance. She decided to come on the show because, as she put it, she needed someone to expose him, to validate her truth, and to finally make him see what he had done. She came to me seeking vindication, not introspection. And that, of course, presented a unique challenge, because my job isn't to take sides or to validate a one-sided narrative. My job is to challenge those narratives, to peel back the layers, and to help people find their own truth, however uncomfortable it might be. When Brenda finally sat across from me on the stage, the tension in the studio was palpable. She was ready for a fight, ready to present her meticulously crafted case. She had her notes, her examples, her list of grievances, all prepared for battle. My job, however, wasn't to engage in a debate about who was right or wrong in the specifics of her marriage. My job was to disrupt the entire framework of her thinking, to get her to step out of the courtroom she had built in her mind and into a place of self-reflection. I started by letting her speak, letting her vent, letting her lay out her full narrative. She was eloquent, passionate, and convincing. She detailed years of perceived slights, financial woes, emotional neglect, and infidelity. She spoke of how her ex had stolen her youth, destroyed her self-esteem, and left her with nothing. As she spoke, I watched her closely, not just listening to her words, but observing her body language, the flicker in her eyes, the set of her jaw. There was a fierce determination, yes, but also a deep-seated fragility, almost a desperation to be seen as the victim. After she had exhausted her primary arguments, after she had laid out her case, I leaned forward. "Brenda," I said, my voice calm but firm, "I hear you. I hear the pain, the anger, the frustration. And I'm not here to tell you that your ex-husband was perfect, or that he didn't make mistakes, or even that he didn't hurt you. But what I am here to tell you is that your focus on his actions, on his failures, has become a prison you've built for yourself. She bristled, her eyes narrowing. It's not a prison, Dr. Phil. It's the truth. He's responsible for all of this. Is he? I challenged gently. Brenda, let's play this out. Let's say for a moment that everything you say is 100% true. He was a terrible husband. He was financially irresponsible. He was emotionally unavailable. Let's assume all of that. What then? Does that give you your life back? Does that heal your heart? Does that make you happy? Because what I'm seeing is a woman who, despite being right, is still deeply unhappy, still stuck, still consumed by something that happened years ago. She tried to interrupt, to deflect, but I held her gaze. Think about it. You've spent years blaming him. How has that worked out for you? Has it made you feel better? Has it helped you move on? Or has it kept you tied to him perhaps more tightly than you ever were when you were married? This was the first crack in her armor. She paused, a flicker of uncertainty crossing her face. But if I don't blame him, then what? It was his fault. I didn't do anything wrong, and that's the core issue, isn't it? I pressed this idea that if you admit even a sliver of responsibility, it somehow negates your pain or makes you a bad person. Brenda, every relationship is a two-way street. Every dynamic has two contributors. Even if one person is 90% responsible, you are still 10%. And that 10%, that tiny sliver, is where your power lies. That's the part you can control. I then went for the jugular in a way that I knew would cut through her defenses. Brenda, I'm going to tell you something you may not want to hear. By consistently blaming your ex-husband for everything, you are effectively giving him all the power over your present and future. You're telling yourself, I can't be happy until he changes, until he admits fault, until he somehow undoes the past. That means he still controls you. He still dictates your emotional state. He still holds the key to your happiness. Is that what you want? Her eyes welled up. The anger, for a moment, seemed to recede, replaced by a raw vulnerability. No, she whispered, her voice barely audible. No, I don't want that. Then you have to stop giving him that power, I continued, my voice softening slightly, but maintaining its firmness. You have to take it back. And taking it back doesn't mean forgiving him or absolving him or saying he was right. It means acknowledging your own role, your own choices, your own contributions to the dynamic. It means saying, okay, I chose to stay in that situation for X number of years. I chose to react to his actions in Y way. I chose to carry this anger for Z amount of time. It's not about guilt, Brenda. It's about agency. It's about regaining control over your own life by understanding your own part in it. I then pushed a bit further. What if, just for a moment, you considered that you also contributed to the dysfunction? What if you considered that your consistent blame, your inability to move past the past, is now causing harm to your children, to your future relationships, to your own well-being? Is it possible that your truth is actually holding you captive? She finally broke down, tears streaming down her face. It wasn't the dramatic, self-pitying cry I often see. It was a cry of release, of an almost overwhelming burden being lifted, however momentarily. That was the breakthrough moment. It wasn't an admission of everything, not yet, but it was an opening, a willingness to look, truly look, for the first time in years. That moment of vulnerability on stage, that raw, unvarnished admission of not wanting to give her ex-husband continued power, was a crucial turning point for Brenda. It wasn't about erasing her pain or invalidating her experiences. It was about shifting her perspective ever so slightly from being a passive recipient of circumstances to an active participant in her own life. It was about helping her see that while she couldn't change the past, she absolutely held the power to shape her present and future. I gave her a moment to compose herself, allowing the weight of that realization to settle. Then I spoke again. Brenda, the first step in taking your power back is to recognize that you have choices. You always have choices. Even when you felt trapped, even when you felt like a victim, you were still making choices, consciously or unconsciously. The choice to stay, the choice to react, the choice to carry resentment. These were all choices. And the good news about that is, if you made those choices, you can make different ones. We started to unpack the concept of radical responsibility. Not blaming herself for everything, but taking responsibility for her responses to what happened. I explained that when we externalize all blame, we empower others to dictate our emotional state. We become dependent on their actions or apologies for our own peace. Are you going to wait for your ex-husband to suddenly have an epiphany and apologize for everything you believe he did wrong before you allow yourself to be happy? I ask her directly, because if you are, you could be waiting for a very long time and you're essentially putting your happiness on hold, giving him control over it for the rest of your life. She shook her head slowly. No, I don't want him to wait. Good, I affirmed. Because he holds no key to your happiness. Only you do. And that key is in understanding your own role, your own patterns, and then choosing to break them. We then moved into practical steps. I challenged her to identify just one area where she could take responsibility, even a small one. It wasn't about admitting she caused the divorce, but perhaps admitting she contributed to the negativity of an argument, or that she chose to withhold communication, or that she perhaps expected too much from him at certain times. It was about finding a starting point, however small, for self-reflection. The hardest part for many people like Brenda is letting go of the rightness. The idea that if you admit any fault, you lose your moral high ground. I explained to her that being right is a very lonely place when it comes at the expense of your peace and your relationships. Brenda, I said, you can be right or you can be happy. You very rarely get to be both when you're clinging to past grievances. This statement resonated deeply with her. She had been right for so long, and it had brought her nothing but continued anguish. I also emphasized the impact on her children. I pointed out that by constantly bad-mouthing their father, she wasn't just hurting him, she was hurting them. She was forcing them to choose sides, burdening them with adult problems, and creating a toxic environment that would inevitably damage their own future relationships. Do you want your children to grow up believing that marriage is a war and that blame is the only weapon? I asked her. That hit her hard. The love for her children was a powerful motivator, a leverage point that helped her push past her own ego. By the end of that segment, Brenda wasn't magically cured, of course. This isn't Hollywood. But she had experienced a significant breakthrough. The rigid shell of blame had cracked. She had glimpsed the possibility of a different way of being, a life where her emotional state wasn't dictated by the actions of others. She left the stage with homework to start journaling, not about what her ex did, but about her own reactions, her own choices, and her own feelings, without assigning blame, to practice catching herself when she started to externalize and instead asking herself, what is my part in this? What can I do differently? And most importantly, to commit to no longer using her children as emotional pawns. This was the first step on a long road, but it was a step in the right direction, away from the prison of blame and towards the freedom of self-awareness. The aftermath of such a public confrontation, particularly when someone has spent decades building a protective shell of blame, is rarely a straight line to transformation. For Brenda, the initial breakthrough on stage was a powerful, emotional moment, but real change takes consistent effort and a willingness to sit with discomfort. The days and weeks following the show were, predictably, a mixed bag of progress and relapse. I had follow-up conversations with Brenda, both off camera and in subsequent segments. She admitted that the initial high of the breakthrough was often followed by periods of intense doubt and a resurgence of her old pattern. It was like a muscle memory, deeply ingrained. When something went wrong, her immediate, almost reflexive response was to point the finger. She'd call me frustrated, saying, "Doctor, Phil, I tried, but then he did this, and I just couldn't help but get angry all over again." My response was always consistent. Brenda, it's not about being perfect. It's about being persistent. When you feel that urge to blame, that's your cue to pause. Ask yourself, what's the real feeling underneath this anger? What is my choice in this moment? It's a practice, not a destination. We worked on specific techniques. I encouraged her to write down her grievances, but then immediately follow that with a written reflection on her own contribution, her own feelings, and her own desired outcome. This wasn't about excusing her ex, it was about redirecting her focus and reclaiming her agency. One of the most significant shifts I observed was in her interactions with her children. Having seen the pain her blame was causing them, she made a conscious, albeit difficult, effort to stop discussing their father negatively in front of them. It wasn't easy. Old habits die hard. But when she felt the urge to vent, she would call a trusted friend or even me rather than burden her kids. This created a palpable sense of relief for them. And slowly, their relationships with both parents began to improve, becoming less strained, less fraught with loyalty conflicts. That, for Brenda, was a powerful motivator, seeing the positive ripple effect of her efforts. Her relationship with her ex-husband also saw subtle changes. When she stopped engaging in the blame game, when she refused to take the bait during their co-parenting discussions, the dynamic began to shift. He, in turn, became less defensive, less withdrawn. The constant conflict was exhausting for both of them, and when Brenda pulled back from her aggressive stance, it created space for more productive, albeit still challenging, conversations. She wasn't suddenly friends with him, but the animosity began to dissipate, replaced by a grudging, distant respect for the sake of their children. Brenda began to recognize the insidious ways her blame had permeated other areas of her life. She started journaling about her career dissatisfaction, and instead of blaming unsupportive bosses, she began to identify her own lack of proactive communication, her tendency to procrastinate, or her fear of advocating for herself. This was a monumental leap. It wasn't about self-criticism in a negative sense. It was about self-awareness leading to self-empowerment. She started taking workshops, networking more effectively, and actively seeking out opportunities rather than waiting for them to materialize or blaming external forces for their absence. Romantically, she was still cautious, but she approached new connections with a different lens. She was more aware of her own triggers, her own patterns of expectation, and her own tendency to project past hurts onto new partners. She was learning to identify her needs and communicate them directly, rather than expecting others to read her mind or blaming them when they failed to meet unstated expectations. It was a slow, sometimes painful process of shedding old skins, but she was committed. The outcome for Brenda, at the time of our last official follow-up, wasn't a fairy tale ending. She didn't suddenly fall in love, become a CEO, or have a perfect relationship with her ex. That's not how life works. But she had achieved something far more significant. She had reclaimed her internal locus of control. She understood that while external events would always occur, her response to them was always her choice. She had learned to disentangle her self-worth from others' actions and to hold herself accountable for her own emotional landscape. She still had moments of frustration, moments where the old narratives crept back in, but now she had the tools to challenge them. She understood that true strength wasn't about proving someone else wrong. It was about taking responsibility for her own journey, her own happiness, and her own peace. She realized that the truth she had clung to for so long, the one where her ex was entirely at fault, had actually been a greater prison than any physical one. By letting go of the need to blame, she wasn't just freeing him, she was finally, truly setting herself free. The story wasn't over, but for the first time in her adult life, Brenda was actively writing the next chapters rather than simply narrating the ones that had already been written for her. She had moved from "I blamed my ex for everything" to "I am responsible for myself," and that, in my line of work, is a profound and lasting transformation. The journey Brenda embarked on, post-show, wasn't merely about personal growth. It was a testament to the fundamental human capacity for change, even after years of entrenched patterns. It reminds me, time and again, that the biggest obstacle we often face isn't the external circumstances, but the internal narratives we cling to. Brenda's initial belief that her life was largely dictated by the actions of her ex-husband was a powerful one, reinforced by years of repetition and, no doubt, by well-meaning friends who validated her victim status. Breaking free from that required immense courage and a willingness to confront truths that were deeply uncomfortable. I remember a specific conversation with her a few months after her initial appearance. She called, not in a state of crisis, but with a newfound clarity. She told me about an incident where her ex had again done something she found irritating or unhelpful regarding their children. In the past, this would have sent her into a spiral of anger, followed by calls to the kids to complain, or a confrontational email to him. This time, she said, she felt the familiar surge of frustration, but instead of reacting, she paused. She took out her journal, as I had suggested, and started writing. But instead of cataloging his faults, she wrote about her own feelings, her disappointment, her fear of being unsupported, her lingering sense of injustice. Then she wrote about what she could do. She decided to approach the situation with a direct, calm email, stating her boundary and her expectations for future communication without any accusations or blame. She didn't expect a perfect response from him, and she didn't get one immediately, but she felt a profound sense of peace because she had acted deliberately from a place of choice, not reaction. "Dr. Phil," she told me, her voice steady, "it's not about him anymore. It's about me. It's about how I choose to respond, and honestly, it's exhausting to be angry all the time. I just don't want to live that way anymore." That was the moment I knew the shift was truly taking hold. It wasn't about a single grand gesture or a dramatic apology from her ex. It was about her internal landscape, her day-to-day choices, and her quiet determination to rewrite her emotional script. Her relationship with her children continued to heal in profound ways. When she stopped bad-mouthing their father, they felt permission to have their own relationships with him, free from guilt. She started having open, honest conversations with them about her own struggles, admitting that she hadn't always handled things perfectly. This vulnerability, this willingness to acknowledge her imperfections, endeared her to them in a way that her previous righteous anger never could. They saw her as human, not just as a suffering martyr. This repaired trust and brought them closer, demonstrating that even long-standing emotional damage can begin to mend when patterns are broken. Professionally, Brenda started to thrive. She stopped waiting for opportunities and began creating them. She took a challenging new role at her company, a position she might have shied away from before, fearing failure and having someone else to blame. Now, she approached it with a sense of ownership, seeing challenges as opportunities to learn and grow rather than as external forces working against her. Her colleagues noticed a change. She was more collaborative, less defensive, and more focused on solutions than on problems. While she hadn't found a new romantic partner yet, she was no longer actively seeking one from a place of desperation or neediness. She was focused on building a fulfilling life for herself, on cultivating her own happiness. She understood that a healthy relationship would emerge from a healthy self, not the other way around. She was learning to like herself, to trust herself, and to take responsibility for her own well-being rather than looking for someone else to complete her or to fix her past hurts. Brenda's story, then, isn't about the dramatic resolution of a conflict with an ex-husband. It's about the internal liberation that comes when you choose to stop being a prisoner of your past and a victim of others' action. It's about understanding that while pain is inevitable in life, suffering is often a choice to cling to resentment, to rehearse old wounds, to externalize all responsibility. She learned that true power isn't found in proving you're right. It's found in taking ownership of your life, your choices, and your emotional destiny. It's a powerful lesson for anyone caught in the cycle of blame. The person you're really hurting is yourself. By blaming, you give away your power, you stay stuck, and you delay your own healing. Brenda came to my show wanting me to validate her blaming. Instead, I challenged her to let it go, and in doing so, she unlocked a future she hadn't dared to imagine. A future defined by her choices, her growth, and her own peace. It's the most rewarding outcome I can ever hope for, to see someone finally step into their own agency and write their next chapter, not as a reaction to their past, but as a deliberate creation of their future.